Hello again, YouTube. I just was going to follow up on what I mentioned last week, which was world building. I've done quite a bit of world building. Like I said last week, I tend not to prefer to do the established genre-based or campaign-based world settings. Golarion for Pathfinder, I never used it. Greyhawk I will use occasionally. Forgotten Realms, I played in it, I have never really run it. So all of these, they're great settings. I'm not saying anything against them. I just tend to, I don't know, whatever reason, I tend to like to build my own worlds. First world was based in the Chronicles of Prydain. I tend to be inspired by certain themes or concepts that I want to play around with, and that's why you come up with your own world setting, so you can have your own homebrew rules or new concepts you want to play test that aren't part of the standard rules. So as an example, Prydain I started with because I was a big fan of the works of Lloyd Alexander at the time. Nothing really deeper than that. I'm very much Celtic extraction, so anything in the Celtic lore has kind of always been, whether it's Irish, Scottish, Welsh, or whatever, has always been a fascination to me. And some of my favorite genres I haven't done anything with because I haven't really wrapped my mind around yet how to replicate that in a game setting. For instance, I haven't done anything with David Eddings' Belgariad Malorion series, because how do you do will in the word when the main rules are established for how many spells per day can you prepare to cast? Once you cast, you've forgotten it, so you can't just keep recasting unless you prepare it for several times a day. Spell points, I'm playing with them right now in Talav, my current first edition AD&D setting. But even then, it's still, you're limited by what's in your spell books. So it's a little, I still couldn't run a David Eddings campaign with those rules that I put together. On Pathfinder, I came up with a setting called Alberon because I like the Church Knights in another series of David Eddings that features a character named Sparhawk. And I noticed that, at least at that time, there were no real spontaneous divine casters. This was before the first of their supplement books for players came out with the Inquisitor, which still doesn't fit the kind of idea that I was looking at, simply because the Inquisitor is really a Pathfinder version of the Inquisitors of Warhammer, and as far as I'm concerned. So I came up with these, basically intended to be really kick-butt, spontaneous divine casters that were, knights of this church that I created. Of course, the problem is sometimes you put a lot of work into this stuff, and your players do nothing with it. The first campaign I ran in Alberon, not a single player rolled up a church knight. Not one. So sometimes you got to bear in mind, as a DM, players like to go with what they know, and they'll leave a lot of your stuff alone because they don't know it. We started to do another campaign in that setting, and somebody actually did create a church knight, and then it kind of fell apart. So, and that happens. Groups fall apart. I've also done a little kind of hemi-demi Middle-earth type of setting for AD&D. That's actually pretty simple to do. So when it comes to building a world, first thing you've got to do is, what are you playing with thematically? Do you have a particular type of history that you want to have in the background that you think is really cool, and so you really want to go with that? Is there a particular aspect to the rules that you want to play around with, that you want to see if it actually works and becomes part of your own personal campaign, regardless of what you're running? This is also a viable option. Actually, with the Alberon campaign, I had the Church Knights, yes, but the thing that inspired me to write up this world was I'd been reading some of the Splat books about the draconic deities. And so I got to thinking, well, what if some cataclysmic event happened that caused a war among the gods of a world, and all the standard gods basically got exiled because they lost their power base in that world, either because their worshippers were all exterminated or whatever. And so these draconic gods became the only game in town. So I took that step a little bit further, because obviously, why would a draconic deity accept a non-dragon as a worshipper? Dragons have been exterminated. I had them set up as being the original protectors of all the lesser races that then abused that power. And then basically I took the Blood War as well from 2nd edition and had it spill over into this world. So I also have, for instance, as gods, Orcus, Demogorgon, Asmodeus, Beelzebub, they all achieved actual godhood in this world. And this began its own little struggle for power kind of in the background. There's one of the arcs that I could run is the Archdevil Bel, trying to attain godhood on his own. He was a quasi-deity, and he was just trying to get to that first level to just have enough worshippers become a demigod. So that can set up some interesting story arcs. But when you go into it, a lot of it is how deeply do you want to go into it. I do have a background in astrophysics, and I'll tell you right now, trying to figure out lunar cycles, even if you got one single moon, is a pain in the neck. Just wing it. Just make it work. Remember, this is fantasy science fiction not a fantasy role-playing game, not a science fiction role-playing game. So the gods move the moons, so they do whatever you want them to do. And then just have the cycles. And a lot of it depends on how much you're going to bring that into the game. Does it actually impact magic, for instance? Does a cleric's healing spell automatically maximize during the full moon, and so they don't have to roll an 8-sided die to see, on a Cure Light Wound spell, to see how much damage they healed? It automatically heals 8 points of damage. Whereas in the new moon, does it only heal 1 point no matter what, or does it not work? And conversely, cause light wounds on a new moon causes 8 points of damage, and during the full moon it may not even work, or it causes minimal damage of 1 point. These are just, things that you have to throw out there. I find actually designing gods fairly easy. It's like really designing an incredibly powerful NPC, to be perfectly honest. The main thing to do is to figure out how many gods you want, and how specialized do you want them to be. There are certain things that you should have covered, so that no matter what flavor of cleric somebody wants to create, you have, for instance, a nature god for the druids. You have a god that really hates undead or really loves undead for those clerics. A god that is fond of healing or is fond of harming. These are various aspects, and you can even go the route that Arcanus went. Now, some of you may not be familiar with the Arcanus game setting. It was a setting as part of the organized play during the 3rd edition days, and it's become its own thing now. And the gods there didn't have alignments. They had facets, and it was depending on what the worshipper wanted. So, for instance, the goddess of love and beauty was also the mistress of thorns. So alignment was based on the worshipper, not the individual, not the god itself. Then obviously you want to have gods for the blasters, god of fire, god of thunder, whatever. God of magic? Maybe. Do you want magic users in your world to basically be atheists and scientists and, the ultimate and sterile, I reject all forms of religiosity and mysticism? In which case, probably not a god of magic. You could almost take some of the modern debates between theologians and scientists that we have in the real world and turn that into a game setting in itself, where magic users, illusionists, anybody who taps into arcane energies, they might believe in a god, like you do have the occasional scientist that has some kind of a theology, a personal theology, or they may be full-out atheists, and they are the bane and anathema to the clerics, because the clerics saying, this is a gift from God. This is the powers imbued to me by my God. And the magicians, they're going, actually, I can explain exactly how you cast that spell. It has nothing to do with gods. It's a manipulation of certain types of energies, and start going into formulas. And there's your conflict right there. So there's any number of ways you can go about it. But once I know how many gods I'm going to create for a campaign setting, and what they cover, then the rest is just coming up with the personalities, just like an NPC. Coming up with their abilities. Again, an NPC with classes. A very powerful one, so he's got a lot of abilities and he can do nasty stuff. In first edition, I make gods unkillable. You can go to Gladsheim and track Thor down on his home temple and kill him. A little bit while later, he reforms a new avatar, because that's what you killed, and says, all right, that was a really cute trick. Now let me show you how it's really done. And you're not coming back. So any physical manifestation of a god in my games are avatars. And yes, you can destroy an avatar, but the essence of the god goes on. And the more difficult it is for them to form an avatar, the more upset they're going to be with you. And they've got a long time to wait for revenge. So it's never going to be precipitate in any way, shape, or form. So for me, the real challenge is actually, believe it or not, coming up with a basic map. Some people are really great at that. I can't draw worth a darn. My stick figures look like they're 9 months pregnant. So my attempts at cartography have been sometimes laughable at best. I had a campaign world for Rollmaster, and everybody said the continent looked like a phallus. And it does. I could show a picture. I won't, but the southern part of the continent was a bulbous mass, and the middle and northern parts were narrow. You can fill in the gaps yourself, I'm sure. So I am terrible at cartography, and yes, I've tried Incarnate, I've tried Campaign Cartographer. The problem is I'm not a CAD person. I don't think in layers like a graphic design person does, like somebody does CAD, and they're all based on CAD, computer assisted design, for those that don't know. And because I don't think of those layers, my attempts at experimenting with them have been, I will go back to drawing maps, let's put it that way. So that's my weakness as a world designer, is coming up with the blessed maps. Once I have the map set up, I can populate it. I can sit there and look at the drawing and go, okay, this looks like a good place for a kingdom of frost giants, these high mountains with all these glaciers and perpetual snowcap. Whereas this area with a lot of volcanoes, well, that could be a fire giant realm, or it could be the lair of the most powerful red dragons ever to stalk the world. Whatever I want to come up with. Where I excel at is coming up with the history. I always keep my planets fairly short history, rather than do millions of years of history, simply because I'm not trying to write an encyclopedia. but I will always have a rough timeline of ancient prehistory, and then I will have a sketched out area of, I'll figure out for myself, was there a Dark Ages? Or do we pretty much know roughly what history was, and that the earlier you go back in the historical record, because they were as focused on writing it all down, it gets a little sketchy, but more recent records are more complete. And then I'll just simply fill it in as the play continues. As every now and then you get, like I have one player in my games, bless her heart, she loves absorbing the history. So every lore master she comes across, every bookstore they go into, every library they go into, she's trying to find historical textbooks so she can learn about the history of the world. I love it. And so I just got to fill in the information she's seeking. All I get from her is roughly what period of time are you trying to learn more about, and then we fill it in. Talav is a sandbox game. That's the other thing you got to think about as a world builder. Do you want to sandbox it or have story arcs? I've done both. Sandboxing is good if you're good at winging. If you are a DM that does not improvise on the fly very well, sandboxing is not for you. And the problem with a story arc, the weakness of a story arc, is it can very easily run into railroading. So it's a fine balance, and I recommend any DM to play to your strengths. I tend to do both well, but I even as good as I am at coming up with a story, sometimes I will railroad a little bit, and so at that point I like to put in some kind of a prophecy to drive the story, which my players love because that gives them, again, a mystery to delve into, because none of them know what the prophecies at work are. And so they're researching and trying to find copies of the prophecies. And then, of course, being prophecies, they're very cryptic, so that's a puzzle for them to solve. Who's who and who's supposed to do what to fulfill the prophecy, and so on and so forth. But again, you need to let your players know at the outset, this is the kind of game we're going to play, so that they can get into it. If they're not into that kind of stuff, brush up on your improv skills so you can sandbox it. Now, one thing that I do that can help people who are, as a suggestion for people who are a little weaker on improv, to do a sandbox game, have a bunch of monsters pre-generated. All different climes, all different backgrounds, environments, whatever. If you have got a lot of time, go through the monster manual and just monster by monster come up with and put them on like 3x5 index cards, fully developed, hit points rolled, everything, any treasure they might have, and that way you can use those for the random wilderness encounters that the players come across, and see if there may be a lair nearby or something like that. That kind of helps keep things moving. At the same time, allows the players the freedom to choose where to go next. And then for the storyboarding, have some specific locations. You can even drop pre-planned modules if you want to. Right now in my sandbox game, they're finishing up the Lost Caverns of Shokanth, but I've got a segue for the another 2 modules that Gary Gygax wrote that I can drop right in there if I want to. Or they can go back to exploring the world and seeking out new life, new civilizations. Oh, wait a minute, that's Star Trek. And, when you look at, speaking of science fiction, when you look at world building in a sci-fi game setting, it's just more expansive. It's just not one planet, it's a whole bunch of planets and civilizations. But basically your campaign map, instead of a continent or a planet, is a galaxy or a stellar cluster. So those are kind of my rambling thoughts on world building. I'll think about I'll take a look at some of the feedback I get from this video and see if there are some other things that people might want to, or if I want to expand more on some of the aspects in world building on my next video. So leave me some comments, give me some ideas to ramble about next, and I'll see you on the next